means, and you must find some of these which boost your self-esteem, which boost your confidence in yourself, and thereby, with the help perhaps of somebody in your age group who can help you along the voyage of life, along your career as a student in this community, you could overcome this need for continuously playing for sympathy or empathy.
Can you please tell us about generalized anxiety disorder? This question is for Dr. Ghorpade.
See, anxiety is a universal phenomenon.
Can you check your mic connection, Dr. Ghorpade? I think there is a problem with the connection with Dr. Ghorpade.
If we can move on to the next question, I think we can come back.
Now you are able to hear?
Yeah, better.
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. See, anxiety is a phenomena that is universal, right from womb to tomb. Anybody at any time of their life will suffer. There's no doubt about that. As some of the existentialists say, it is anxiety is because we are walking on a thin crust of earth which can give way and take us to a dark chamber. That is the kind of insecurity that bothers us and makes us more anxious. And these kind of things, where there is no cause, we call it as a generalized anxiety disorder. Whereas if the anxiety is related to a particular item, for example, germs or cleanliness, we call it obsession, or like a avoidance, we call it as a phobia, or a mixed with depression and anxiety, we call it mixed anxiety and depression disorder. But anxiety is the basic stream on which different kinds of waves form, for which we give a particular, the name is for us to understand and decide about the management. It is not going to do anything else. That's why generalized anxiety disorder is like a cloud which is not formed well, has no shape. When it forms a shape, some people see a devil in it, some people see a God in it. That's all.
Okay, before we go to the next question, apologies to the panelists. There are a few long questions, and Shivani and I will make sure that we break the question in few parts. We did not realize that. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay. The next question is.
What I want to say, Sudev, is it's very good that people are coming up with what's on their minds. We don't mind the length of the question. We also may not measure up to your expectations, in which case we'll be happy to continue this dialogue through email if necessary. Okay?
Okay. And so, Dr. Vide, if possible, we also had shared a PDF with you of the same set of questions. Perhaps that will make it easy for you to refer to the questions.
Okay.
I'm not sure, but anyway, I'll move on to the next question.
Yeah.
What are triggers? How to recognize when a person is triggered? Can colors, fragrances, or sounds trigger a person? This question is for Dr. Bhide.
Sorry, come again. You're talking about triggers, and triggers setting off psychological problems, right?
So the person is asking how to recognize when a person is triggered. Can colors, fragrances, or sounds trigger a person? That is the question.
Triggered in the sense, I guess you're talking about something that sets a stimulus is there, and that particular stimulus causes some kind of psychological disturbance. And the kind of disturbance I think would be either emotional upheaval, anxiety, sadness, or breaking down into tears, or getting very angry and aggressive. Yes, it's for you to analyze your life, and introspection is a great strategy in this regard. Look at your life, keep a daily journal. This is something which I ask almost all of my patients to do. And when you write down clearly a daily journal, mind you, your daily journal should not be an FIR book where you record only things going wrong. Summarize how your day went overall. You will be able to recognize what triggers negative or unhealthy emotions in your day-to-day life. It could be just seeing your mother with whom you don't get along. It could be a reminder of something from the past in the form of a letter. Now, triggers can be different, but the specific ones you've asked about, color, sound, fragrances, that's a little uncommon and also a little dramatic. It's not impossible that certain fragrances remind you of where you had encountered that fragrance, and the memory associated with it might be very, very bad, and that sets you off on a downward trend. Also, these triggers bring up stuff from the past that you haven't fully resolved, and you need to break it down into finding out why you never resolved this issue. And you have to sometimes learn to let bygones be bygones, which takes time. But I think introspection is a great strategy for recognizing what are your particular triggers and how you might be able to deal with them in the long run. For different people, different triggers are there, and sometimes people are not, they're puzzled by the fact that, hey, this particular stimulus sets me off. How come it doesn't set you off? Please recognize that each one's triggers are very different depending on what have been your experiences. The other person's past, the other person's ability to cope with stress might be very, very different, and therefore he does not get triggered by the same circumstances or stimuli. Also, be empathetic to people who get set off by triggers. In your case, in your institute and places like that, the trigger could be the amount of work that is given to you, a particular teacher with whom you've not had let us say, a decent relationship. It could be a bad experience with a peer, somebody from your peer group. All these can be triggers that you must be able to recognize and address without necessarily getting into a conflictual situation.
Over to the next question. Sometimes I start feeling restless and anxious out of nowhere. It often peaks at a particular time of the day and subsides after a few hours like nothing has happened. There are often no underlying triggers, event or thoughts. Can environmental changes or physiological changes result in anxiety? This question is for Dr. Vaijayanti.
Well, see, I can tell you one thing that as Dr. Ajit Bide previously pointed out, anxiety and depression overlap. Till now, we know about the fact that depression has a diurnal rhythm, far worse early morning than in the evenings. Of course, atypical depression may not have that circadian rhythm or variation in the time, but if it is biological depression, then the person is likely to feel worse in the early mornings than in the evenings. Now, if you read Body Keeps No Scores of Bessel van der Kolk on post-traumatic stress disorder, he talks about how PTSD gets worse. Now, if this person's anxiety disorder, if you would like to classify it in a particular diagnosis, then we could confidently say with more information if the diagnosis actually varies with the time during the day. Okay, that is something that we can say depending upon the diagnosis that we make. And second part of it was, can environmental and physiological changes. See, environmental, again, I think Dr. Bide said that there can be emotional triggers, like somebody with whom you have had conflict, or suppose somebody has abused you in the past. It could be emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, harassment. I don't know. It could be a number of things. If you have to encounter such a person, you could have a flashback which can last for days or months, in fact. Okay, so I do not know what kind of anxiety are you referring to, and I would require more information, a full-fledged diagnosis. But based on the limited information that I do have, I can tell you confidently that there are few diagnoses or in psychiatry that show changes during the day and towards the environment. And also, if you're triggered for anxiety and you have 6 cups of coffee, which is actually a CNS stimulant, you can get more anxious. You can get jittery. There are certain medications like if you take acid, you're likely to get anxiety attacks. So there are chemical substances which can trigger physiological events. There can be times of the day which can trigger these events. So based on my diagnosis, I can tell you what it is, but whatever little information is given, I can't come to a complete conclusion about it. Hope I answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, person did not specify more than that, so
Yeah.
sure.
Thanks.
So we'll move. I think we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah.
The next question is how to cope up with constant fear, guilt, or a thought that whatever you're doing is not enough. Everything will fall apart anytime. This question is for Dr. Bhide.
So, coping with constant fear, guilt, or a thought. By the way, Sudev, I did get that. I managed to open that PDF file. I had opened it earlier, but not gone through it completely. Sorry. How to cope up with constant fear, guilt, or a thought that whatever you're doing is not enough. Everything will fall apart. Now, if this has been going on for a long time, we are identifying this as something which we call in lay terms as well as in technical terms, something called a inferiority complex, because you feel that whatever you're doing is wrong. It's never going to be enough. It is going to fall apart any time. And if your guilt is based on, now guilt is an emotion which serves a purpose to a limited extent. By and large, our guilt should arouse in us, if we feel guilty, we feel that we've done something wrong. We have wronged somebody, we have not lived up to an expectation of maybe your team, maybe your peer group, maybe your professor, whatever it may be. We need to use that guilt to overcome negative emotions and be a performer. Your guilt should drive you to correction. And if that is not happening, then you are stuck somewhere, and the system needs to be lubricated so that the wheels are going around properly all over again. This will call, again, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go on emphasizing this thing about introspection. Find out, is your guilt really warranted? Is it really in proportion to what you had done and something went wrong? Is there no way of rectifying this? If there is a way of rectifying it, then please set about it. Quite often it helps to open up to a friend and mention these negative emotions that are bugging your life, so to say. Constant fear, that is anxiety underlying all your actions, can sometimes be because people have given you negative feedback for too long, and that has worked on your system, building in you what I talked about earlier, a sense of inferiority or inadequacy. And we definitely find that people who have such a fear of, such a personality of inadequacy will underperform most of the time. Everything is not going to fall apart is a message you need to give yourself when you have this feeling that everything will fall apart, by actually looking at things that you have achieved. Have realistic goals. Don't expect to complete 4 chapters just before a test on the next day. This is something I deal with college students, not only from ISC, but all over. But they save everything for the last minute. They are busy with XYZ project, or they are busy with other commitments. Worst of all is getting your priorities mixed up and spending too much time in non-important activity and bad time management. If you get your time management in order, the chances of these things going amiss is greatly reduced. If your fear is the underlying emotion much of your day, please seek professional help, because that is spelling out what Ghodpade was talking about earlier, that is generalized anxiety, anxiety that pervades your day all the time.
So now over to the next question. Probably because of the anxiety, my brain is constantly thinking and I am unable to focus on anything I am working. People have started calling me absent-minded. I tried meditation, but that makes things even worse. It becomes a session of thinking, don't thinking, stop thinking. I am unable to meditate. The meditation increases my heartbeat. I feel very restless and hopeless. My mental peace is all the time low. Can you please tell me step-by-step process on how do I go about in improving my situation? This question is for Dr. Vajanti.
I would want to consider obsessive rumination as a provisional diagnosis here, because I think that constant, although this may not make sense to all the audience, see, there is a disorder called obsessive compulsive disorder. And even if there is one thought that you're not able to get rid of, and which is repeats over a period of time, it can be considered compulsive disorder. Now, if you are having a cycle of thoughts about what happened during the day, or what did somebody say yesterday, or of all the things that were going wrong for several months, all of this does look like obsessive rumination, because it looks like you have no space in your mind for anything else. It's like cluttered with thoughts. So I would suggest that you spend some time with a therapist so that we can understand exactly what with you. This is what I would feel. And I think that untreated obsessive compulsive disorder in the long run will make a person feel hopeless, and it can morph into depression. So before it goes in for depression, I think that it is starting here. So I think that thought stopping is a cognitive behavior therapeutic procedure that we can start in this case. And mindfulness is something else that we can start. Mindfulness is to focus on your actions rather than on your thoughts, so that at any given point of time, if you are having tea, you will recognize, see, I picked up this cup, I have kept it on this saucer, I have taken the cup, now I'm sipping my tea. Like this, you have to run a running commentary about your actions, so that you will slowly replace the thought process in your brain to correlate more with the actions than with your internal world in which you're getting lost. This is the useful tip that I can give considering this situation. But I think this person requires to talk to a psychologist or psychiatrist as quickly as possible, because this can't be handled by a question and answer in a general talk.
May I add something over here?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
In addition to Dr. Vaijayanti's very useful tips, I want to say this, that every form of meditation does not suit everybody. There are indeed a substantial number of people whose anxiety becomes worse when they start in some forms of meditation. I'm a practitioner of a meditation from my undergraduate days called transcendental meditation, and I noticed that it does not suit everybody. First of all, don't start meditation entirely on your own. There are very, very, very few of us who can do meditation without being initiated into the process and without participating in meditation in a small group to start with. That way you perfect your technique of meditation. Different meditations give emphasis to different things like a mantra or an image or a thought that you must concentrate on. Meditation is largely an art of cultivating your alertness. It's called restful alertness in my form of meditation. Have a proper initiator, whether you're doing Sahajamarga meditation, whether you're doing mindfulness meditation, or close to that is something called Vipassana, or whether you're doing transcendental meditation. Concentrate on meditation only after you've been properly initiated, and share with your preceptor or teacher of meditation that you're having these problems, that your heart starts beating fast when you're doing meditation. Meditation has a lot of benefit in a cumulative fashion. If you do it for 2 or 3 sessions, you will find something good. But then if you skip it and try to come back to it, you will find the situation is either not improving or getting worse. So please be very, very guarded about how devoted you are to your form of meditation, and take instruction properly from a trained person in any form of meditation. Not only psychologists and psychiatrists train you in meditation. In TM, the lady who was teaching me was a grandmother who had her own problems in life. She found it helped her, and she trained 3 or 4 of my classmates and me in transcendental meditation, and we were very grateful for that proper training. There is a lot of literature which suggests that people who go to the Sri Sri Ravi Shankar Ashram, or they go to the Isha Foundation, most people benefit a lot from that form of meditation, but some people become much worse. So be cautious about that.
All right. The next question is, what is a panic attack? How to recognize a panic attack? How do you help a person who is having a panic attack? This question is for Dr. Gohapade.
I told you about generalized anxiety disorder, wherein anxiety will be prevailing throughout the day, affecting the day-to-day function. Whereas in a panic disorder, anxiety comes like a bolt from the blue, lasts for a few seconds or a minute, and then just disappears, leaving the individual calm and serene. So these are what we call as a panic disorder. Comes intermittently without subjecting or affecting the person to a great extent, but it can affect over a course of time because of repeated these kind of episodes. To recognize would be very easy, because when the panic attack comes, the only thing that occurs to the individual is it, am I going to live or am I going to die? Nobody wants to die. Everybody wants to live. That's why we'll make all efforts to live. That increases his anxiety to such an extent that his respiration is very rapid and heartbeat very fast, and a freezing kind of a feeling will come. Neither he can run nor can stay there. This will last for some time. The about helping a person of this kind, probably a cognitive behavior therapy or a behavior therapy or even supportive psychotherapy also would be very useful, because we have to understand that the three level, the psychic level, we have to understand why the panic attack occurs. At the object level, if you say what happens in the panic attack and how to overcome. For example, if the respiration is very high or rapid, we ask them to breathe slowly and steadily close the eyes. So by this, the anxiety symptoms will come down. This he can do it on his own after some time. The psychotherapy would be educating and finding out the real cause. So this is how we can handle this. And this is a commonest disorder, I would say, because recently in the Corona-19, I think this was the most probably commonest disorder. Whenever we hear a person having a corona infection, we tend to become panicky or scared.
Okay, before we move on to the next question, I think I would request the panelists to perhaps look at the question number 11 when Shivani reads out the question, because it's quite long. It might be a bit difficult to follow when she's speaking. Over to you, Shivani.
Okay, thank you, Deep. I have problems in my married life, and I think it has got something to do with the mental health of my spouse. I have talked to the available mental health professional resources on multiple occasions, explaining things from my point of view, and was told to get my spouse to talk to them to figure out what is going wrong. However, my spouse has been unwilling to seek help and instead been accusing me of being mentally unstable to talk to mental health experts. I had requested my in-laws to help convince my spouse to seek help, but they also seem to have a taboo associated with that and have conveniently ducked all my requests. My spouse definitely has OCD issues and also have been claiming to be asexual. I have also been experiencing gaslighting and silent treatments whenever I try to do anything about these issues. As my spouse has not been cooperating to get help, I have been going through a lot of online resources and I am concerned if my spouse has narcissistic personality disorder. I have been trying to be as detached as possible to be sane, but that approach does not seem to work for a long term. I'm missing out on many things, physically and emotionally. What can I do in this situation? This question is for Dr. Vajanti and Dr. Vide.
Okay. I think Dr. Bide can start off and then I can talk about the later issues. I think this question has three parts. The first is a person not willing to see a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist. So how do we deal with stigma? That is the first part of the question. Then you have a second part of the question is, it does have obsessive compulsive disorder and allusions to cleaning compulsions as well as avoidance of intimacy. Okay, and the third part of the question is about narcissistic personality disorder. Now that is as mentioned in the kind of pop literature, as I would call it, pop psychology has come about narcissistic personality disorder. Now, these are the three parts of this question. As far as stigma goes, yes, it is you, and perhaps getting in touch with a psychiatric social worker who is willing to pay a house visit or willing to talk to the family could help with that part of the stigma. Is my addressal of the first half of the question. And the second half of the question regarding the specific obsessive compulsive symptoms, until this person accepts they have a problem, we cannot treat a person with obsessive compulsive disorder against their will without their consent. Okay, that amounts to assault. Getting their insight and improving their insight regarding their problems is what we could do. Perhaps we have to go in a roundabout way where we will get in touch with a social worker first, who will get her in touch with a psychologist next, and then a psychiatrist can intervene if we can try pharmacotherapy. Okay, these three parameters are there. And regarding the abuse that the spouse seems to be facing now, and that is a different matter altogether, because gaslighting is a term used to implicate, it's actually an old English film in which I remember Ingrid Bergman is the heroine. And gaslighting is when she is led to believe her own reality to be unreal. That is where the and rearranges all the evidences around the house. So she starts doubting her own thinking. That is gaslighting. So gaslighting is telling that what you think is real is not real. It is real. Now that is a dangerous form of psychological abuse that we are talking about. And if this person is going through that, and silent treatment is again narcissistic personality. Now, narcissistic personality comes under cluster B, and cluster disorders are not very common with obsessive compulsive disorders. Okay, so there I have a problem. So I don't know if this person is self-educating themselves through the so-called pop psychology and has come up with all this. So we need to interview this family and help them with family therapy, couples therapy, individual therapy to accept, we call it as insight-oriented therapy, okay, in order to improve the insight of this person. And I think that it is complicated because of lack to seek help. That's what I can say. We can definitely help, but you would need a social worker also in the loop, is my thoughts. I hope I've answered what I could. I'll give it over to Dr. Bhide. He can also improve upon this.
I thought you were giving me the question to start with, but you've answered most of the issues. So first of all, sympathy to this person who seems to be going through a lot of suffering on account of I'm going to use the term, bad marriage. Because if you have a spouse who doesn't understand you, who doesn't empathize with you, who doesn't relate to you adequately, if there isn't psychological and physical intimacy, the marriage is really not worth the trouble. At least one of those should be there. Dr. Vaijayanti has already told us about pop psychology. I think what happened was when the net came on, the diagnostic criteria for various disorders, and any intelligent layman can really make an adequate psychological diagnosis because the descriptions of those symptoms, and now they are even enumerated. If you have 4 of these 5 symptoms, lack of sleep, getting bad dreams, it means something. That kind of self-reckoner is there, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. If this is an intelligent enough person, and I have no reason to doubt that he isn't, she's entitled or he's entitled to make this diagnosis of NPD and OCD in this individual. Contrary to what Dr. Vaijayanti felt, OCD and these personality disorders sometimes can go together. I don't see an easy way out, and I think Dr. Ghodpade and Dr. Vaijayanti would agree with me that we face this issue of non-cooperative patients patients who need help or are not willing to come for treatment as a very, very common phenomenon. I would reckon that I get stories of such patients, at least 3 new cases every week. All right. So the refusal to take psychiatric treatment, or saying that you're the one who needs help, you go take help. And here the person is also trying to turn the tables on the individual by saying that the very fact that you're going and seeking mental health experts' opinion, it means you are mentally unstable. That's a very crude, simplistic way of avoiding facing up to the problem. It is sad that the in-laws also have not been adequately interfering, willing to interfere and get this person to take due help. What Vaijayanti has suggested, that taking the help of a social worker sometimes works, and it's definitely something worth trying. But can we drive people to consulting room of a mental health professional when they don't want to go? Most of the time, no. We have to use every ruse that can come into our minds to get this person to take help. Well, a strategy which I say is useful is, hello, I've got a problem, and my therapist insists that the family members join in that therapy. At least for that sake, would you come? My feeling is that this person would have already tried that, because it's mentioned over here, he or she has already consulted the mental health professionals on the campus, I guess, and that has not worked. So
Yes.
Beyond a lot of sympathy, I don't know that there is a definite way out. The next thing to find out is this person's work efficiency also affected? In which case, collaborating with other colleagues on the campus might be a strategy that you might try to resort to.
Yeah.
Can
Okay.
I add one?
Yes, please.
Can I add one suggestion?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah.
See, the last sentence is, what can I do in this situation? I think that to answer that, probably I thought there are many instances in the psychiatric literature where a case has been treated or dealt through like father, mother, or somebody else like that. Through them, it has been treated. That sort of a strategy we can use to establish a rapport with that husband and give him enough emotional support, if necessary, a drug support, and then slowly tackle the main person who is the cause of his misery. In that way, probably we can do something, keeping all the rules and regulations in our mind.
Okay, so
Yeah.
the next question that we have is, I have suffered through child sexual abuse. More than my childhood, it affects me now. I had shared these things with some of my friends, but what I have got is betrayal. I've committed certain mistakes as well. Now I am in even more pain. Everything haunts me often. I find myself guilty for everything. I don't feel proud of myself. How to overcome myself from this pain? This question is for Dr. Vaijayanti.
Thank you. This is a common problem because very often children take time to understand that what happened to them was abuse. So a lot of people come up during their early young adult life is when they recognize what happened to them was abuse, and it was sexual abuse. Now, I'm sorry that this person has not contacted a mental health professional first and has gone to their peer group. Depending upon their level of maturity, would have assessed it differently. And this constant feelings of guilt and inadequacy, these things are quite common in children who accommodated abuse, because they tend to judge themselves as to, oh God, this was sexual, then why did I keep quiet? They judge themselves. Forget victim blaming, victim shaming by society. The patient themselves blame themselves for it. So the guilt could be explained by that. So I think this person definitely needs to talk to a mental health professional, because you are not guilty at all for abuse that happened when you were a child, because you had no capacity or you're not or functionally wired to pick up sexual signals as sexual signals when you're small. And therefore, you did not know what was happening to you. And you have come to know about that. All is that I completely sympathize and I completely understand where you're coming from. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Kindly trust and reach out to one of us so that we can help you in some way, because I don't think that it's a public platform is not a place where you would feel comfortable talking about your abuse. And you might have to go, we might have to start from that point onwards and reconstruct your narrative in such a fashion that the new narrative are more empowered and the frameworks change in the new narrative. Okay, so building another alternate narrative of you as a survivor is something that requires quite a lot of psychological work and commitment, and we are willing to extend it for you. Please come forward, and I hope if you're listening, this is specifically for you. We understand, we care, we want to help, okay? And this can't be done in this platform.
Thank you for your answer. I always get high heart rate above 100 BPM when measured. Should I get it checked? This question is for Dr. Ghorpade.
What is the question number?
You're not going by the list, I think, now, no?
Yeah, this is question number 13.
Yeah.
So we just got one question important, and that's why
I know. Okay. I always get high, like I got it. No, I think definitely he has to undergo physical checkup and blood checkup, etc. to rule out any of the organic condition plus any of the heart problems is a must before coming to any conclusion. There's no doubt about that. Then after ruling out any of the physical problems or organic condition, then we can think of any psychological illnesses that he has that could be treated. So first rule out organic condition, then think of psychological. That's all.
Okay, so the next question that we have is, can one behave as if one is depressed while subconsciously the person is just lazy? This question is for Dr. Bhide.
Yeah, I suppose one can. If one is a good actor, one can pretend to be depressed. But where is this laziness in the subconscious? Who's going to dig it out that it's really there in your subconscious that you're lazy? So I think we must respect what anybody's narration of their suffering is and not dismiss it as a pretense. So I think this is probably a very, what should I say, a question that is masking as, actually you must be dealing with somebody whom you want to call lazy, who is calling himself or herself depressed. I notice this attitude quite commonly when people have to deal with a colleague who is depressed, or one has to deal with a child, or sometimes even a parent or a sibling who is depressed. You say that, no, nothing doing. I gave you that example of the paradigm of pull up your socks and move on. How dare you take it easy and laze around. You just don't want to move. These kind of attitudes are what a depressed person very commonly has to face. But if you have enough evidence that this person is lazy and avoiding responsibility, then it is time to take the bull by the horns. Now, when I use an expression like take the bull by the horns, I'm not suggesting an aggressive approach straight away, but have a heart-to-heart talk with this person, explain why you think this person is more lazy than he or she is depressed. If you can convince that person about this, you don't need us anymore. But if you can't convince this person, say, let us take professional help. If you are depressed, it's time that we address that depression with professional help so that you don't remain depressed, at least not to the same extent and not for too long. So that's the way I would like to help handle this person. Can one pretend to be depressed? Like I said in the beginning, those who are good thespians, good actors, they can pretend to be depressed, but that is easily detected.
Can I add something here?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, one thing is, one of the hallmarks of depression is fatigue without exertion. Okay, and then there is lowered self-esteem. So if somebody were to shout, that's why they say depression is a silent killer, because if somebody were to call a depressed person, that person is going to accept, yes, I am lazy, because he anyway has a low self-esteem. And he himself cannot understand why he is having fatigue without exertion, which is one of the major markers of biological depression. So before we jump to any conclusions, I think that we also need to be cautious that this can be a case of, or this can be a person with severe depression without psychotic symptoms, but who has definite self-esteem and perhaps has fatigue without exertion, and you call them lazy, they'll say, yeah, I have always been lazy. That doesn't mean that person is lazy. I think that you should let experts decide on the diagnosis, please, because self-diagnosis, even if I am depressed, I don't think I can diagnose myself. It's not correct, and it won't be right also. So it would be better if this person were to be seen by an expert.
Okay, yeah. Now move to the next question. I have social anxiety, which prevents me from making friends. On the other hand, I always feel lonely. What should I do? This question is for Dr. Bhide and Dr. Ghorpade.
Can you address each question to one individual? It will be easier. I request Dr. Ghorpade to take this up.
Okay, no problem. See, the most important point here is the social anxiety disorder is also a kind of anxiety with a kind of a name given to it, a symptom. So he is afraid of the kind of thing here comes would be the, sorry, I'll just go through the question once again.
So I have social anxiety, which prevents me from making friends. On the other hand, I always feel lonely. What should I do?
Yeah. See, I feel this is a kind of a dilemma that he is in, but we have to find out what is the reason for the dilemma, and I think he needs to consult a psychiatrist to understand the exact problem that he's facing, and then we can think of to do what we can decide what to do. But here what on Q&A session, I think it's impossible to give any definite answer.
All right. Okay. So we'll move to the next question. Professors hold a great deal of power over their subordinates, and in turn, this attracts many candidates with narcissistic personality, and they generally do create a good first impression. Unfortunately, the selection is also based on a good first impression. As a psychiatrist, why is it that you don't participate in the faculty hiring process and provide your analysis so that abusive people do not end up with power in the first place? These are important questions because I and many of my friends have endured this and causes havoc on one's self-esteem and mental health. This question is for Dr. Vaijayanti.
Be comfortable if Dr. Bhide or Dr. Ghorpade were to answer this. Please, I'll hand over the question to them.
Professors hold a great deal of power over their subordinates, understood. This in turn attracts many candidates with narcissistic personality. Candidates who are narcissistic, is it? And they generally do create a good impression. I don't know why they have to be narcissistic to create a good impression. Good students generally create a good impression. Some are very crafty and manage to create a good impression without necessarily being good, but seldom are they narcissistic. Unfortunately, the selection is also based on good first impression. Are we talking about faculty or are we talking about students? I'm not very clear.
Faculties.
Acha, they are the candidates, you mean faculty candidates,
Yes.
for taking up a faculty position.
Yes.
This is a very tricky question. I think you should ask the director whether he would like to involve a psychiatrist in selecting faculty, or a psychologist more appropriately. Usually HR people have something of an exposure to psychology and organizational behavior. That's a tongue twister for me. Is something which HR people are quite well trained in. But please don't imagine that psychiatrists can never be fooled. Even a psychiatrist in one interview or two interviews may not be able to pick up a personality disorder. This is quite commonly the case. I'm sure my colleagues would agree with me. I agree that there is a great deal of victimization that goes on in big institutes because of problem faculty people. And sometimes this kind of problem is indeed created by people who are highly narcissistic, who want salve, that is flattery for their ego all the time. And they will even personally entertain students who suck up to them. And I think this is a very bad trend that obtains in many institutes. I know that there is a subjective feeling of victimization even in your institutes, but I've not come across anybody complaining that a faculty member seems to have a sort of a narcissistic personality constitution so far. I would agree with you that this kind of victimization should not happen, and you should have some forum where you can take this up with management to say that this particular senior faculty member is becoming a bit of a roadblock for my for my progress. This is a very complicated issue. It's a sensitive issue, and I do not think we can pretend that it does not exist. It needs addressing, and again, my theme for the day is sympathy. I sympathize with you. It should not end with my being sympathetic to you. You must find the right kind of forum where you can address this issue. Unfortunately, the Wellness Center, I don't think, is adequately equipped to deal with this by themselves. They can guide you onto other fora where these issues can be addressed.
Okay.
Shivani, one second. Dr. Gorpade, if you would like to add to this.
Yeah, I'm not surprised with this situation which has been narrated here. I have come across on a very many occasions the exactly similar situation where, as a psychiatrist, I was helpless and I could not do anything because the invitation should come from the administrators, or at least a feedback should be taken from the psychiatrist if required. But without all those kind of an institutional policy about which I don't think we can do anything about it. I think, as Bide said, it has to be decided at a multi-level or at a higher level. Till then, this victimization will be, we have to accept as a fact. We are helpless, I would say, in this situation.
So if I may add, Deep here, so if I may add, I think, I'm not sure if Professor Anil Kumar can add to this, but I think the new faculties are in fact being screened by the psychologists. I think this started 5-6 months ago.
Okay. Over to the next question. Okay, sir, I'm a student at ISC. For the last 2 months, I'm suffering from depression. I think I should consult psychiatrist very soon. Can I consult a psychiatrist at my place, which is outside Karnataka, and reimburse the consultation fee and medical fees? I would be very happy if you answer this query. This question is not for the experts. We just wanted to inform students that we are working on it, and the information about it will be made soon.
Very good.
Now, towards the 18th question. I have anxiety while meeting and talking to my advisor. I'm very scared of him. My brain keeps simulating the way I want to have conversation with him related to my work. All of this falls apart when I confront him. I freeze and I mess up every time I meet or talk to him. This cycle continues. How do I know? How do I come out of this cycle? This question is for Dr. Bhide.
Yeah, I think this is a common situation, and I would like to know a little more about the what this person feels about her or his advisor. There are giants in your institute, and I mean in the academic sense, in terms of their academic achievement. They're really great people, and people's reputation very often precedes them, and they'll be scared, oh boy, he's such an authority on this particular branch of life sciences or physics or engineering, whatever it might be. How am I going to face up to him? And when you have an advisor who has to guide your work, inspect your work, correct your work from time to time, you have to have very many interactions. Unfortunately, these interactions become encounters. In this country, encounter has become a bad word. So when you have to have these kind of encounters, it's a good idea to have your material very clearly listed out. Rehearsal in general is a great strategy in life. When you rehearse something, perhaps you rob it of a little spontaneity, that's true, but it's worth sacrificing that much spontaneity. Also, when you're facing a tough advisor, spontaneity is not the most important ingredient in your interaction that you should prize. It should be that your issue should be resolved. Your proper guidance, the guidance that you're seeking must be received. And for that, it's good to rehearse either in front of a mirror, or if you have a good friend available, ideally a senior who has already interacted with this advisor, take their help to finding out how to particularly face this advisor. Also, with a few students, I've noticed this particularly among young PhD students, there is a nervousness which is unwarranted. What I said right at the beginning, that fear of meeting giants is a common phenomenon. Actually, the advisor turns out to be more friendly than this person expected, and then within 1 or 2 sessions, the need for mental health intervention is over. Unfortunately, that is not a very common case, but it's a well-known case. So prepare for meeting the advisor. Also, rehearse what you're going to say when you meet the advisor. Now, there are some advisors who are very formidable, who thrive on creating a little bit of terror around them. That's unfortunate, but true. If that is the case, then ideally go up to this person and say, I'm a little nervous about facing you, sir. Can I have private time with you sometime so I can explain what I need to understand? Some students have adopted my suggestion that they write down what all you need to say to your advisor, pass it on as a slip to the advisor, and most advisors have been quite amused to receive such slips, but we have been able to negotiate the space quite well.
Okay. The next question that we have is, this is again a bit long. I am taking Nexito plus half for past 2 months as suggested by a neurologist. I had MRI, result normal. I was having headaches. It has been reduced after taking the mentioned medicine, but sometimes something happens inside my head which I cannot describe in words. Before taking the medicine, tingling sensations, pain-like pain used to happen. Even now, sometimes something happens inside me and I don't have words to describe it. Once I stopped taking the medicine after 1 month, I was in difficult condition for 1 week. So I started taking the medicine again. What can I do to stop depending on the medicines as I'm afraid that it may erupt again? I have anxiety issues too. I make situations in my mind which are not real and sometimes get engrossed. How to come over it? Mostly I think a lot in bathroom and I'm also doing Anulom Vilom every day. This question is for Dr. Ghorpade.
No, this is one of the another commonest problem that we come across, like not following the psychiatrist suggestion of continuing or discontinue with our supervision. The things here, the Nexito has been started by a non-psychiatrist doctor. Probably I would like to review the whole case and come to a proper diagnosis and then take the decision of which medication he would require and which he does not require. And with the limited data that is available, I would like to say that he is having a kind of a low level of generalized anxiety, probably for which drugs may not be that essential, that we have to assess. That's why a proper assessment by psychiatrist is required. Then only we can come to some conclusion.
Thank you, Dr. Ghorpade. Over to the next question. At times, children behave weirdly because of anxiety that they cannot express. How to understand that a child having anxiety about something and what senior family member can do for this? This question is for Dr. Vajanti.
Okay, thank you for the question. But I wish somebody had understood or somebody had told me what weirdly meant, because weird is seriously a weird word. It doesn't say much about the behavior. All I can tell you is, children, we were all born with a body language, and we were socialized and verbalized at a later date. Okay, that was a process of conditioning. We learned language. We learned language to express our feelings, name our and label our emotions, etc. And children don't know this. So usually children resort to what we call as acting out. That you irritate a child beyond a particular threshold, or sometimes even to a very less threshold. The child will throw what he has in his hands or what she has in her hands, or will bang their head or shout or scream, or all sorts of acting out behaviors are there. And each of these behaviors is so-called behavior is triggered by a stimulus. So a parent has to be, or the elder in the family has to be observant as to what is happening with the child. Sometimes it can be a response to physiological needs, like the child might want to go to toilet, the child might be hungry, the child might be sleepy, and child might not be able to verbalize it. So you need to teach a child to label their needs first, then you have to teach them to label their feelings, so that they tend to verbalize it instead of acting out. And this is the best explanation I can tell you. And the role of the senior or the elder person in the house is, when the child is throwing things, you'll have to hold both the hands of the child, not in a threatening manner, but in a gentle manner. Pat the child and say, please tell me what you're feeling. You're angry now. Is this angry? Why are you angry? Try to engage the child in a conversation so that the child learns that emotions can be labeled and can be verbalized and need not be acted upon. Okay, acting out is just a defense in an adult where your words are never understood, no one hears you properly, then you tend to do act out. So in a caring family where there's a lot of attention, children do find words for their feelings and for their experiences. Hope I answered it.
All right. So the next question that we have is, can anxiety be a side effect of certain medications? This question is for Dr. Ghorpade.
Yeah, there are some medicine which can give rise to anxiety symptoms, but that is not that common compared to a depression or a psychotic behavior induced by medicine. So it can cause, not a big issue. I think one has to keep in mind that medicines could be the cause of some anxiety features.
Okay, over to the next question. Failure in interviews lead to lower self-esteem at times. We tend to develop self-doubt, anxiety over time while preparing for future interviews. How to gain back that confidence and build yourself bottom up again? Follow up to the same question. I feel underconfident in doing things. I always feel that all people around me know more than me and are better than me, and I know nothing about anything. This makes me feel anxious and feel demotivated. Due to this, I am unable to identify my strengths, interests, and take right career choices. How do I deal with this? This question is for Dr. Bhide.
I think this is a fairly common phenomenon. It is related to what I talked about earlier, a feeling of inferiority. And if the feeling becomes very deep rooted and is encountered in almost every pass of your life, then we call it an inferiority complex. We say complex because it's very difficult to undo it, unravel it, and move on in life. So we tend to develop self-doubt and anxiety over a time while preparing for future interviews. If this has happened repeatedly, certainly this is true. Now, if it has happened repeatedly, again, review and analyze what mistakes might you have made. If it was genuinely, it was an interview that was carried out genuinely where you were denied a particular position or a particular grant because the other proposals were better, then you have to eat humble pie and acknowledge that perhaps you need to work a little harder at making yourself more efficient, and through your efficiency, you have to and articulateness, you have to be able to convince others that you deserve a particular position or that particular grant that you are seeking. If it has happened repeatedly, it could also be that you had a lot of good stuff in you, and we encounter this in college students quite commonly. They go up to the examination hall, they are confident until they enter, the question papers are distributed, and by the time they are reading the first or the second question, suddenly there is an evaporation of confidence. There is a feeling that I don't know anything, the mind blanks out. This is usually a manifest of a sudden attack of anxiety. And if you are a victim of that kind of anxiety, that anxiety definitely needs addressing long before you actually face an interview or an examination. Due to this, I am unable to identify my strengths and interests and take right career choices. So spend time with yourself. Introspection, introspection, introspection. Make a list of your strengths. Make a list of things that you have done well in life. Make a list of where you might be wanting, for example, in certain mathematical problems which you have not able to. Statistical analysis is one thing which all researchers have to be adequately familiar with. Spend time improving your skills wherever your deficiencies are, but first spend time identifying your deficiencies. Also, don't berate yourself when you have certain worthiness. We are the greatest enemies of our self-esteem, I'll tell you that. More than others, we berate ourselves. This I've encountered in life generally and in clinical practice very, very frequently. So if you sufficiently praise yourself, don't get carried away. When you've done something good, pat yourself on the back and say, hey, I did well in this. In my generation, it wasn't common, but I noticed this the thing on the play field, whether it's tennis or cricket, this kind of gesture. It is an overplay of confidence, but I think that it speaks volumes of me that yes, this person is going to go far because he has built up this realistic confidence in himself on account of certain achievement. So do not hesitate to give yourself a pat on the back is another part of my message to you. Again, if you've been facing repeated failures, take the help of somebody close to you to try and understand why this is happening only to you in comparison to others. If that also doesn't work, yes, time to move on to professional help.
Okay, the next question is, at times some people get anxious without any serious problem. How to deal with this anxiety which is without any solid reason? This question is for Dr. Ghorpade. Dr. Ghorpade?
I was just reading the question once again. See, that's why when you cannot find out an answer as to why you have become anxious, I think some kind of a professional help is necessary to decipher that anxiety. This anxiety is like a crypted language where encryption is required. The failure to encrypt is the cause of the suffering. So when they go to a professional, probably the encrypting would help them a lot. And then when they know the cause of anxiety, the anxiety can no longer trouble them. That is the principle of this kind of a problem tackling. So till we do not see the devil, we will be anxious. Once we see the devil and become friendly with it, I think no more anxiety. That's the approach.
Over to the next question. How to deal with those seniors who keep pressurizing you to think twice or again and again? What a big mistake of your life you have done to join this lab and choose this lab to build a career in science and academia. They don't leave any stone unturned to keep reminding you what a failure you will be in life since you choose this lab. Please let us know how to deal with such seniors and such negativity constantly. This question is for Dr. Bhide.
Yeah, I think we've divided it nicely. So problems with faculty are coming to me, problems with anxiety are going to Dr. Ghorpade. And a number of other issues going to Dr. Vaijanti, of course. I think this is a very unhealthy trend among perhaps some seniors who want to survive, and there are lots of people like this who survive on making you feel small. It's an unfortunate thing. You must look at yourself in the mirror and see that you are not small at all. And you need to boost your self-love and your self-esteem. The two are related but not identical. I'll have more to say about that at a later date sometime. Who keep pressurizing you to think twice and twice again. What a big mistake of your life you have done to join the lab. Now, I'm assuming these seniors are not faculty. They are your seniors in the courses.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So cynicism can be very, very contagious. Please don't be a victim of cynicism. If your seniors have had pressurizing you to think twice about what a big mistake you made when you're choosing life in science, I think a life in science is never wasted. It may not get you great monetary rewards, but your intellect is and your intellectual achievements are going to be your reward in the long run. And you must make your peace with that is what you have opted to do. You are a Saraswati Bhakta in a sense. I'm not trying to be religious over here, but just using a metaphor to drive home a point that Saraswati and Lakshmi do not necessarily go together. There are very wise people who know how to use Saraswati to get Lakshmi into their house, but I hope you understand what I'm talking about. So knowledge in itself and academic achievement is what you should be looking forward to. They don't leave any stone unturned to keep reminding you what a failure you will be in life since you chose this lab. I have had this situation in my own personal life in a sense. My daughter, who was set out to be a scientist, she was a microbiologist and she wanted to do a PhD, met a number of frustrated microbiologists, some of them brilliant, some of them with PhDs, including from your institute, who told her, listen, baby, don't go this way. And in spite of my urging her not to do this, she opted to do an MBA rather than go on to try and get a PhD. So after her master's, she changed course and went into an MBA. So this is the hard reality of life, that the competition in this field is quite tough. So if you're going to pursue a life in science, you want to combine it with industrial training or management, that's up to you. But if you want to be devoted to the life of seeking knowledge for research, then you must be totally devoted to it and not look at the material success of others who are going to go ahead with other degrees. But if people are continuously reminding you that you are a failure, then there's something wrong with them. And they are the ones who need help much more than you do. Some advice is generally given with good intention, but some advice comes out of one's own cynicism, saying that, oh, you don't know how terrible it is. Now, that's the kind of thing I was talking about earlier, the personal example. So if that is the case, then introspect and see how devoted you are to this quest for knowledge, this thirst for knowledge, one might say. And the life in science is very commonly related only to a thirst for knowledge.
Okay, the next question.
The simple answer to how to deal with such seniors is stay away from them if you're clear that you want to continue your life in science. Do not allow these seniors much more time in your lives than is absolutely necessary.
Okay. The next question that we have is, procrastination as a result of perfectionism was very relatable to me. Can you give any tips to control it? I go through cycles of over planning, then getting overwhelmed by the amount of work, underperforming, and then guilt over it. I'm losing trust in myself, and it feels I really cannot function even as a human. This question is for Dr. Vaijayanti.
Okay. I think that procrastination, not being able to meet with the deadlines, all of it goes with perfectionism as a trait. Okay. So just to make a point, trait is your marker or is your predisposition to do certain things in a certain way. Whereas state is something that happens to you because you're alive. There are days when you are in a happy mood. There are days when you're in a sad mood, etc. So mood is a state, whereas perfectionism is a trait. Now, traits determine our regular behavior. So if you're going to be too much of a perfectionist in drawing up a table, then perhaps, you'll be only making a timetable instead of actually completing any task in that period of time. So do not push your perfectionism to beyond the level of perfectionism to something totally illogical. I think that is what is happening with the person who has asked this question. And best way to handle procrastination, however stupid it may sound, is to start the first step as soon as we finish with this talk. Okay, so it is basically not looking at 100 steps later what's going to happen. What am I going to do next 3 hours, next 2 hours, or maybe next half an hour, next 15 minutes. So start reducing the time for which you plan, okay, and reduce the total length of time for which you're planning. Make it very, very short. Plan for just today, live for the day, but make sure that day is productive and you achieve as much as you can that particular day. So start with one day at a time. Slowly you'll make progress. The best way or the only practical way to handle procrastination is don't procrastinate. I know I sound very cliched, but the best thing to do is don't plan for next all through 5 years of PhD. Please don't. Start with today, plan for the next 10 days, then next 15 days, and you count like that. So don't plan. Don't make a huge, elaborate plan. That's what leads to procrastination, because the timetable itself gives you a satisfaction as if you have completed the task. When in actuality, all you have done is draw up a timetable. Okay, so understand each task for the value it is. Give it the value and the weightage that it should be given. All said and done, a very good timetable does not show that you accomplished anything. It's just a reassurance that you can. Okay, it's just a reassurance you can. And once you have that reassurance, start acting. That's all I will say. Start doing and plan for the next as quickly as possible. Okay, don't waste time in planning, and don't get anxious or overwhelmed by the enormity of portions that you have to cover. Forget about that. Just think of what you can cover today for the next 4 hours. That's the best way to deal with procrastination in academics. Okay, procrastination can happen in every facet of life, in every sort of decision making. But with respect to academics, this is my best advice.
If I might add, there's something called UNCTAD, United Nations Commission for Trade and Development. They commented on the Indian planning. So they said the best 5-year plans come from India. The least adhered to plans are also from India. So procrastination and spending time in over planning is a national disease. And we need to do something about over. Achhe din will come, but if you don't do acha work, achhe din will never come. So I think Vaijayanti's advice is very sound. The strategy for overcoming procrastination is now, not tomorrow, day after, and sitting up and drawing more and more plans. Because you waste so much time in elaborate planning, which look very nice on paper. Implementation is very, very poor. There's a nice couplet, if I may quote from a Hindi song. It says, "Ladakpan khel mein khoya, jawani neend bhar soya, budhapa dekh kar roya." I'm in that stage of budhapa, not rowing so much, but I think use your time when it's available to you.
Okay, thank you for your valuable inputs. Towards the next question. During a conflict or disagreement with my close friends, I start feeling drowsiness suddenly in the middle of the conversation itself. I'm perfectly fine, not tired at all before the incident, but it happens suddenly. Can you please tell me why it happens to me? And it is for Dr. Bhide.
I think you get overpowered by your emotions at that moment, and the fact that it is a conflictual situation, it might be a mild disagreement which can be argued, and sometimes, the very mature stance is to keep an open mind, that you might be making a mistake. You're willing to listen. This is very often missing. The second thing is, if your thoughts have been well garnered and they're quite logical to your mind, and what the other person is saying is not logical to your mind at least, the other mature thing to do is agree to disagree. It doesn't have to lead a perfect resolution to everybody's satisfaction. That should not determine the validity of a good relationship. Okay, your best friend and you disagree about something that happened. Agree to disagree about it. It's a large heart that allows that kind of a resolution of a conflictual situation. If you feel drowsy when in the middle of the disagreement or argument that is going on, it is clearly showing that your nervous system is not able to cope with what is coming towards you, which does not mean your argument is wrong. It does not at all mean that, but you may convey that impression. I said this earlier in a different context. I will say it again. Please rehearse what you need to say, even in a good relationship with a friend with whom you have a disagreement, or a faculty member with whom you have a disagreement, peers with whom you have to debate out certain issues. Put down your reasons, and if you are in a position to make a decision for yourself, abide by it. If you are not in a position to make a decision for yourself, but somebody else is given the power of making decisions, humbly submit to that person is going to make the decision, though you can register your protest and say that I feel otherwise about it. And that's a way that you will not get stuck in this conflictual situation.
I keep missing deadlines, personal and professional. I have reached a stage in which I do not find myself working if I don't feel the anxiety of feeling deadlines. My dreams are now turning into frequent frightening nightmares in which I keep missing deadlines. I feel like quitting everything. Is there any hope for me? This question is for all the panelists.
I think there's plenty of hope for you. You've recognized the problem in yourself. This is in our parlance what we call insight. You've gained insight into your situation. And definitely if you battle this situation in a methodical fashion, you will move ahead. It may take some time. It will not happen overnight again. I keep missing deadlines, personal and professional. Now, what are the next deadline you have? Going to the tone set by Dr. Vaijayanti answering an earlier question about procrastination, start now. What is the next deadline you have to meet? Is it about a particular project? Is it about inspecting something? Is it about researching something? What do you need to do for that? Don't allow your negative image of yourself to fester, to become worse and worse and worse because you're brooding about it. That way you will move forward and your nightmares will slowly get resolved into healthier dreams over a period of time. Please give yourself enough time. Please give yourself objectivity to understand why you have become a person who has been not meeting deadlines, personal and professional. Also, are you confusing one with the other? Very commonly, this work-life balance is not there in place. Please bring it into place so that you give enough priority to, you decide what your priorities are and allocate enough time to each of your targets in your professional life, and do not neglect your personal life. Don't take your personal or family life for granted. Don't assume that your spouse or your girlfriend or your life partner or your family will necessarily take the brunt while you go around building your career. For many people in junior faculty position, this is tremendously important that you have a work-life balance.
Over to the next question. What is OCD?
Shivani, one sec. So if the other panelists would like to weigh in on this.
Yeah, please.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay. I have only one thing to add. The deadlines are the root cause of your problem. Okay. Now, the best way of handling this would be to try to live in this moment rather than any other moment. When you live in the present moment, the deadline you can easily fulfill, irrespective of whatever it is. The second point would be the deadline should be in every field of your life, not just academic or something. Then what happens? The severity of this deadline will come down. When you live in the present, I think there will be no more deadline. You can achieve whatever you want. Then the hopes will be definitely will be there, shining like a bright sun in your life.
Okay, towards the next question. What is OCD? Is it a kind of anxiety? What causes OCD? This question is for Dr. Ghorpade.
Shivani, can I say something? I'll just take a short break. I'll be back in 2 minutes if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Yes,
sure.
yeah.
See,
Okay, we'll continue with the session.
Yeah. OCD is a basic cause is anxiety, and on the top of it, it will take some
I don't think he's audible, no?
Yeah, I think there's a problem with the connection.
Now, yeah, you are able to
Yeah.
hear?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. See, the main thing would be OCD is a form of anxiety wherein all the anxiety features are given a meaning to it. The meaning and the form is in the obsession or a compulsion. This is a very common disorder, but is a one we can say if it is in limited way, it can be a boon. If it is exceeds the limit, it can become really a bane in one's life. What else is the question? It is treatable. There's no doubt about it. And many another thing is very commonly seen. Maybe is not recognized well. That's why most of them do not come to seek the help of a psychiatrist.
Is Dr. Bide back?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So anyway, I'll move on to the next question. I feel extremely worried or anxious whenever I have to approach my guide or senior lab mates for clearing my doubts or discuss my work. Even after preparing, I still keep feeling underprepared and tend to put off the meeting until I'm forced to, left with no other choice but to meet them. Because of this attitude, I am losing a lot of time. How do I come out of this? This is for Dr. Vaijayanti.
I think that Dr. Bide answered a very similar question, and he was talking about rehearsal and rehearsal with a friendly senior. Okay, not a hostile senior. All seniors won't be hostile. There will be somebody who is friendly. Now, if this person has very bad experiences with authoritative figures in the past, then they'll have to work on their own psyche to get over that. Because here the nature of the guide or the nature of the seniors is not mentioned. Only thing that is mentioned is the subjective sense of anxiety while approaching these people. And the person who is posing this question recognizes the problem to be his own rather than that of the other. In which case, what Dr. Bide already told, the things like rehearsal, modeling, sometimes watch another contemporary of yours, a batchmate of yours, see how they are seeking help. Help seeking is a skill, it's a soft skill, and not many people who are intelligent have it. Most people in IISc are extremely intelligent. So you need to work on how to seek help, because seeking help is not that much encouraged in many cultures as a toxic self-help is encouraged. Whether you know or not, you pretend like you know everything. That is encouraged a lot more than to go and honestly ask somebody, listen, I don't know this. How do I handle this? So as Dr. Bide already said, look into a mirror, talk to your mother or talk to your sister, somebody, and go on phrasing that question in different ways of how to seek help, and practice seeking help, practice offering help when you see somebody is in trouble, because it's a two-way street. Okay, only you can't be only offering help without asking for help. So if you need help, learn how to ask. That's a very important skill not taught to us, and it is something that we need to learn. Okay, because help seeking is as much of a skill as offering help. We are trying to offer help after years and years of studying and practicing. So seeking help also may require a lot of effort, but you have to learn it because it is a life-saving skill. Okay, you can't be drowning in an ocean and not seek help at all if you don't know swimming. Okay, at least you need to scream. So please learn, seek help is my advice, because help seeking is a very superior soft skill, and it has to be taught, and it's a life skill, and it has to be learned. And I wish, like how you're taught cooking, how you're taught to serve food, you must be taught how to seek help. Especially if you're intelligent, you must and should be taught, because intelligent people never ask for help. And that is what I've been noticing even in your institute. Okay, the best are the ones who crumble the most because they don't ask help.
Right. I think it's a matter of pride very often. That you feel that you're in some way compromising your pride by asking for help.
Yeah, maybe. True. Nothing wrong with all of us need each other. Without each other, we won't live. So there is no loss of any ego by telling somebody, I don't know something. You're privileged when you're a student. Imagine becoming a consultant and going and telling people, I don't know how to treat this. I mean, it's better you ask when you're a student, right? You people are students. Please seek help, not when you become guides, because then it's a problem. Now it is easier. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I get angry when people don't do things according to my suggestions. I don't know how to deal with imperfections. I always keep telling that you should do things in that way. How to deal with this and take out the best from the people. That is focusing more on the positive of the people than the negative. This question for all the panelists.
I think that we only have a right to be impose certain restrictions on ourselves regarding perfectionism or a particular methodology. Okay, it may be like, see, 7 plus 5 may be 12, 10 plus 2 may be 12, and 8 plus 4 may be 12. There may be so many different combinations which can give the same result. You have no right to dictate to a person what methodology they should follow to arrive at a particular result. And the person who took a route other than yours might be improvising in a way you may have never known. Learn to be humble is all I can say. You will have to cultivate humility, because that is the shadow of arrogance. Okay, what you show to the world is your persona. The shadow of it is what you don't show. And usually people who are humble are very confident. Actually, you perhaps have to work on your confidence levels and recognize that to each his own. Live and let live policy. You have figured a way to do something too good for you. I'm happy for you. But do not obstruct another person from doing things the way they want to do. Okay, each individual has their own, their own individual style, and they are evolving. If something is not good enough, they'll change. They'll take your suggestions. You do not become what you call hegemonic, is all I will say. Hegemonic, dictatorial. I know we are seeing a lot of it in the world today, but that doesn't mean that should be encouraged.
Correct,
okay,
correct.
Let's be democratic. That's all I would say. If anybody wants to add anything, I'll be glad.
Yeah, I think that's quite complete.
Okay. So yeah, we have almost run out of time, and I was thinking if I could invite Professor Anil Kumar to give a few concluding remarks and also tell us a little bit about the referral and reimbursement policy. Professor Anil Kumar.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me thank Dr. Bide, Dr. Vaijayanti, and Dr. Ghorpade for this wonderful session. So they are part of the Wellness Center. So we always get their help whenever we need. So thank you, Dr. Bide, Dr. Vaijayanti, and Dr. Ghorpade. So regarding the referrals, this is being discussed, and Dr. Bide knows about it. So we are identified a panel of psychiatrists as well as psychologists around, IAC and in Bangalore. So we will be discussing with them very soon. So all the modalities have been more or less worked out. So soon we will be announcing the policy on that. So it has to go through administrative approvals and other things. So this is about the referrals. So you will come to know about it pretty soon. So hopefully within few days after we have the discussion with the individual psychiatrist and the psychologist with the modalities that we have worked out, we will be announcing that pretty soon. And the second thing I just wanted to tell you is that, the Wellness Center is a one which facilitates avenues for mental health. So many times we will not be taking administrative decisions. See, and also I just wanted to tell you that, we are in the process of recruiting 2 psychiatric social workers For example, Dr. Vaijayanti was mentioning to one of the answers that, sometimes we need the help of psychiatric social workers. And my colleagues, Dr. Suja Elizabeth and Dr. Vishwesha Guttal, is working along with other panelists to recruit these two people. So we have received all the applications. Soon we will be recruiting them. So the interviews are scheduled around mid of September. So if everything goes fine from October onwards, you could see 2 psychiatric social workers in the campus. So that will add to the pool. So, and more and more, avenues are being opened up in the campus. So we will, you please visit the Wellness Center website and you will see the updates there. So thank you for your attention. Thank you all the participants. Over to Deep and Shivani.
Thank you, Professor. So before we leave, I have 3 announcements. The first is that if at all any one of you is interested in joining us empaths, then they can, I think there was a form circulated in the chats some time ago. So you may enter the details through that form if you are interested in joining us empaths. The second thing is, this is the first of many planned monthly sessions. So this Ask the Experts is a monthly session. Yeah, Professor.
No, sorry, that was by mistake.
Oh, okay. So yeah, the second announcement is that this session, Ask the Experts, is going to be a monthly session on the 4th Saturday. So every month, the 4th Saturday, we'll be having this Ask the Expert sessions where you can get your questions answered. And the third thing is, we have been receiving dozens of questions, and unfortunately, we have not been able to address all of them. So we will be taking up whatever questions we could not answer today in the next session. So we hope that you do attend the next session. And lastly, I now would like to thank Shudev and Dr. Sridhar for helping us organize this particular event. I thank all the empath members for their support. And I thank you all for coming, and see you in the next session.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. We're delighted to be here. I have a small suggestion.
Yes, yeah.
I wonder if the open sessions, you can have about 5 mixed bag kind of questions. But if your sessions can be, emotional life, anger, jealousy, career progress, if they could be thematically based, I wonder if it will help. It's just a thought that crossed my mind.
So Dr. Bede, what has happened is, we do have those theme-based sessions. So the last session was actually on anxiety. But we thought that there are many unanswered questions, and we thought that every month we should have a dedicated session just to answer
anybody.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
In which case, you should restrict the number of questions. I feel very bad for people who ask questions and have to go without an answer. So if you say that the first 40 questions will be taken up, it might help.
We'll keep that in mind. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very well organized program, and it was a delight to be here and
thank you.
Hear a wide variety of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bede. Thank you, Dr. Vaijayanti. Thank you, Dr. Gulpade. I hope you are still here. Thank you all for being here for the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Okay. On behalf of the Wellness Center, I would like to thank Shivani and Deep for anchoring this session so well. And also, I thank all the members of Empaths for taking this initiative forward. And we had a very fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye. See you in the next session.
Right.